This is the second part of a three-part presentation, or three presentations on the same subject as we see in this title. This one is called Seeing the Incredible Genesis Account, or the Incredible Genesis Account as Credible. Okay, and it is actually the first, although it's the second one we've presented, and it's Genesis and Genetics. The other two are Geology and Genesis. Did I say that right? Genetics and Genesis, yes. Geology and Genesis. And the one that we have already presented is Genesis, as you never heard it before. So those are the three talks. And I want to make a couple of statements here. Most of you in this audience are aware, or I'll put it this way, have made your decisions and are not needing to be convinced that God created the world and that it didn't happen by evolution. But I pray that this will, one, inform your decision, inform your faith. If for nothing else, Lord, to help you defend your faith to those that you might be speaking with who are struggling in this particular area. What is the scripture says, be always ready to have, I'm sorry, I've dropped the verse, to be ready to defend your faith. I'm sorry, I'll have to paraphrase it. This was assembled about 10 years ago, maybe even a little longer. But I believe that it's still applicable, and we'll take it from there. So, let's see if I can figure out how to make the slides advance. There we go. And the question is, Earth's living creatures, immensely diverse and complex. But what is the source of this immense diversity of life? And we have a bar here. By the way, this is heavily graphic. There's a lot of things to see. And I'll do my best for those that are just on audio, to be able to understand what we're looking at. So we have a bar, and on the one end, it's supernatural, and on the other end is natural, according to natural, or only by natural law, and particularly would be godlessness or atheistic. So on the supernatural side, we say forces outside of our natural world. That is a miracle, or miraculous creation and development. And on the natural end, it would be the result of natural processes. And then I have on this bar, I have four explanations that you might hear people say. One at the very end, extreme end of the supernatural, is what I'll call the four literal dayers, those who say that it's 6 literal days God created. That's a very supernatural, called into existence creation. And as we move toward the natural end, we would have those that would say, well, I hold that God directed evolution, that evolution is really the process, and God is really like the puppeteer moving the strings to make it happen that way. Further toward the natural end is, well, God, like the clockmaker, started the mechanism and designed the rules of evolution, or nature, supposedly, that causes evolution, but he let it go, and it's running by itself today. And then finally, on the extreme natural end is, God had nothing to do with it. There is no God, and it's all by nature, and that's all there is, and the nature ticking away has caused evolution. So those are your four, I guess, in this spectrum from supernatural to atheistic natural. So in what category would you put the men who made the following statements? So I'm going to read some statements, and we're going to figure out what box to put them in. Have ye not read that God, who made them at the beginning, made them male and female? And of course, that is stated by Jesus. And the question would be, is where would you put that on the spectrum? Would you put it on the natural end, halfway, or would you put it up at the upper end? Well, let's look at that. He uses the word made, so God made. That's a pretty clear indication of a supernatural event, and it's at the beginning. So from the origin of things, he made them. I say that is a very strong statement at the very supernatural end. Okay. Next statement. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes have been clearly seen through what is made. And that, of course, is Paul, the apostle. And I'm sorry I didn't put the scripture reference here, but he uses the word creation, and he uses the word made. And again, these two words, and I'm looking back at our bar here with the four spectrum of philosophies, if you will, and I point out that these are either the direct literal, or you could say that God is directing it with strings. He made it, but he used evolution to do it. So you could stretch that circle to include those two philosophies. Now, how about the chap that made the following statement? It is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing in the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms have all been produced by laws acting around us. There is grandeur in this view of life. This statement was made by Charles Darwin in his book Origin of Species, 6th edition. And I point out that the statement here, have all been produced by laws acting around us. Now, I point out that in this spectrum, this circle that would envelop them would at least be the atheistic end, but someone might say, well, he's not really commenting about whether there is a God and whether God caused it, but at least God started it, and it's all operating by natural law at that point. So the point I want to make, though, is that we have to back up from all of this and realize that everything but the, I'll call it extreme, supernatural end, the literal God did it and that's it, are all based on the concept or the process of evolution being true. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today. All these, that God directed it, or God started it and walked away, or it's all natural and there is no God, all those are founded on this concept that we accept that evolution is a true process. And so on questions of origins, the biblical worldview is in conflict with that of evolution. At least the biblical end is got a tension toward the supernatural or creationist end, whereas evolution is in tension toward the natural or evolutionist end. And so someone might ask, and many want to ask, is can't they both be true? And that is these two middle ones, God directed it, created it, and, God corrected it and is created it and is directing it, or God started it and walked away. Can't we accept those as being acceptable in a biblical interpretive view? And I point out that that's like a string tied between the biblical and evolution, and I have a little knot tied there in the middle between them, and that knot is in extreme tension. It is not the natural reading of the biblical view. We have to read those into it. So the question is evolution true? And that is two subpoints. Is it supported by the evidence? And number two, does the literal account fit better? And that's an important point, because we can say, we can have a theory thrown up and we can say that's not true, but what do you replace it with? What is the other, when you don't have any answer for things, any answer that comes up, no matter how unbelievable, becomes debatable, becomes, you have to say some reason caused it. So anyway, those two principles. Now, we are immersed in an evolutionary culture, and this is probably more true of those in, I'll call it, in classical, even Christian environments who are more involved with the world, but also those that are lost in the world and are not in a Christian circle. So they're, you'll see in the news articles and everything, you'll see these phrases, millions and millions of years ago, or back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, or cavemen, positively Neanderthal, or prehistoric times. By the way, if we read in the Bible, what is prehistoric? Since our Bible goes back to the origins, there is no prehistoric unless you want to go back before creation. But even that concept assumes the Bible is not true. So we live in this in this bubble and are surrounded by these terms, and our minds are affected by them, and yet we're trying to answer the question of whether there is truth, there is a truth behind them that violates them. So my point here is that when we're in the middle of this kind of environment, it's difficult to be objective about it. And the old saying is, if you want to know about water, don't ask a fish. Because a fish, and this is a picture of Dory, a fish lives in water and it doesn't know what no water is, so it can't be objective about its experience. So just what is evolution? Now, there really are multiple definitions of evolution. In fact, you'll go and find many of them. And that's probably one of the problems, because the definitions are created for different arguments. So the majority of paleontologists have accepted this following statement, is biological evolution is change in the properties of populations of organisms that transcend the lifetime of a single individual. That's almost hard to fathom that one. That's from Douglas Uchkama, I guess, of Evolutionary Biology, the book Evolutionary Biology. And you can find this written in many places. And it's kind of a cryptic thing. You have to put your head around it. What is he actually trying to say? But notice where he says, properties of populations. It's the change of the properties of groups of organisms that transcend, cross the lifetimes of a single creature or individual in those that is evolving. So an example that's been put forth, and it's kind of an antiquated as an example, but in the early days, it was one of the ones that brought the popular culture to accept evolution. It's the peppered moth. And the peppered moth was a moth that existed in England, and it existed in two forms, a light form and a dark form. And it was noted by certain people, and I don't know if the data is really solid, but it was noted by some that the light form was very common, and the dark form was not common before the industrial era in Britain. And then after the industrial era, and it was particularly due to the soot of the coal fires that ran the industrial machinery, that the trees were getting sooted and dark, and someone noticed that the light ones didn't exist as much. There were much fewer numbers, and that the dark forms were actually increasing in number. So there was a shift from the light form to the dark form of this particular peppered moth. And I show here at the bottom, I show a graph showing the populations on a given year. This is just made-up data, and it shows one form in the red bars is there are lots of them, and that as the years go by, those large numbers shrink down to low numbers, and that going back to the first year, we have a very low number, and this would represent the dark forms, and over time the dark forms increase in number until the end bar we have most of them are the dark form, and we have low numbers of the light form. So, excuse me. So, showing the before, this graph just showing the concept of before, we had the high numbers of the light and the low numbers of the dark, and afterwards we shift that to high numbers of the dark and low numbers of the light. And so I point out here that evolution is change over time. And so here are the questions. Do we see the populations of the animals changing over generations? In other words, has there been a change in the populations, the properties of the populations? Well, the answer is yes. So then that would mean that according to this definition, evolution must be true. Yeah? See, we saw a change, right? Well, I have to ask this. We need to take a second look at this peppered moth example here. And notice that when we started, how many types did we start with? How many types of creatures, forms? Well, we started with two. a dark and a light. And afterwards, what did we have? How many did we have? We had 2. There were just 2 types when we finished, just like there were in the beginning. So was there anything new that came into existence through this? Did anything really change other than some numbers of something increased and the other numbers decreased? So the answer to that is no. No, there was no change in actual creatures. It was just the populations that changed. And so I asked this question too. Here's another way to look at the same thing. I have the same chart, but rather than seeing the dark forms increase, which is represented in the little blue bars, rather than seeing them increase over time, I am just going to I'm coming up with a mechanism. Let's say it's mechanical, and it goes out and finds all the light forms and kills them. It just squashes them. And this machine runs for years until the light forms are decimated. They're just gone. And so according to the definition, the definition from before, and by the way, this is no natural process, it's an unnatural process, but before we had 2 types, and afterwards, well, we only have 1 type. But there's a change in the population, right? So how many types did we start with? Well, 2, and how many did we finish with? Just 1. So very clearly the populations have shifted. Is this evolution? You kill off an animal and you have evolved? Something doesn't fit. This doesn't seem right to us. That's not the concept of evolution that everybody uses when they talk about evolution. So my point here is that this definition, referring to the change in the properties of populations, is really a twisted definition for the purposes of propping up the belief in evolution when it really can't be supported. So we're just going to move on now to what is evolution as the popular. What do people mean when they use the word evolution? And by the way, what people believe, what evolution means, was taught to us by the last generation of paleontologists. That's where this definition that we all use. So what do I say the popular definition is? And this is from the Oxford Concise Science Dictionary. Evolution is the gradual process by which the present diversity of plant and animal life arose from the earliest and most primitive organisms, which has believed to have been continuing for the past 3,000 million years. That's 3 billion years. I don't know why they just don't say 3 billion years. But that's their definition. And that is really what people think of, a gradual process. When I say, boy, the situation has evolved, I mean there has been a change over time such that the new situation is different from the old situation. And notice here that the word gradual process, and that's very important. And we're going to be examining that. Is it gradual? Does the data support this gradual process? Now, here we have a picture of the proposed evolutionary tree, the tree of life, as it's referred to. And it has one trunk and many branches, and out on the tips of the branches are all these different kinds of creatures. At the very peak of one branch is vertebrates, and that would include mammals, but that's a whole lot more. That's even lizards and everything else. That's just one point. On the other branch, we have trees, and others we have microbes of different microbacteria. But all these, according to the theory of evolution, is supposed to have come from one origin stock, and we're going to be examining this. So here I have a new drawing, or a different drawing, of the same concept of a tree. It looks more like roots upside down, with tentacle things on a blue background. It's just white lines, and no animals are represented on it. And I've shown it's kind of on a graph paper, and we see that time is going up on this graph. So at the bottom, we have the single trunk again, and as the tree of life that's represented in this is going up, it breaks up into all branches. And at the very top, which would be at current time, we have different groups of these tentacles. The small groups are called genus, and several genus are grouped together in a family, a kind of animal. and we have several families, and under those families we have multiple genus. So, and on the bottom left and right is called morphology. And I think I actually explained this here. Yeah, morphology means variance in form, morph, to change. So as we move from the center where the tree trunk is and we move left and right, the animals are changing more and more different from each other. Now this is not to be actual, this is just a representation, an overall graphic of how the properties work. So as we see as time has increased, we see that these branches move out and create more and more variety of form and broader differences in their forms, variance in form. So today is at the top, I point out. Now let's look at one of the little tendricles, one little branch here. And rather than just being a line, we find out that those lines are made up of individual creatures or populations. One is not an individual creature, but a population. It could be 1,000 years, that one dot representing one kind. But the belief is that as time moves on, as we come into this from the bottom, we see it's moving straight. What does that mean? There's no change, very little change. It dithers around. We're seeing some different forms. But then as it begins to curve over and go horizontal, we're seeing that there's changes going on. And then at some point, there is a split. And there are two forms that come out of that. So there's two different kinds that branch apart. And so this each dot represents a small movement from the last dot. So the changes are gradual in this series, and that's what we believe, and that's what we're being shown this tree of life. That's what's being actually told to us subliminally. So the vertical line is, I don't have status, it really is stasis is the correct term there, and the horizontal, moving horizontally across this branch, as the branch moves horizontally, is rapid change in, quote, evolutionary time. So let's see, I'm going the wrong way. Remember which way to roll it. Now, I have here 3 pictures of creatures, and those of you who can see it, I would ask you, what is this a picture of? And we all know it. It's all a form we've come to identify and love. It's the Tyrannosaurus Rex. But notice that there are different coloring and different settings, but we all know that all 3 of these are Tyrannosaurus Rex because it's obviously a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And I'll point out here that there have been 5, I think it's 5 skeletons, full skeletons or near full skeletons of Tyrannosaurus Rex discovered. They're in different parts of the world, or at least in different areas. I don't know exactly where, but they've also been discovered in different strata indicating different times. But something curious is here, because we don't have one of them that's almost a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and another is fully Tyrannosaurus Rex, and the next is, well, it's leaving Tyrannosaurus Rex into something else. They are all Tyrannosaurus Rex. They're all clearly identified as this Tyrannosaurus Rex. So why is that? Why shouldn't they all be? Shouldn't we have a point in time when we call it a full Tyrannosaurus, and everything earlier and after that would be changing? But that's not what we see. So going back to our little tree, I point out that this branch, this magnification of this little twig, if you will, coming off this tree, the vertical is dots that are, the stasis, meaning not changing, is actually is real data. And then where we see the differences, these different forms over here, after the horizontal, the horizontal dots are blued out because they really don't exist in the fossil record. So we suddenly see this appearance of different forms, but there is no real fossil evidence for these hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of, quote, transitional forms. And this has led to a corrected theory of evolution by Niles Eldridge, I believe it is, and Stephen Jay Gould, now deceased, but these are well-respected evolutionary paleontologists, and they have pointed out, look, we can't fight it anymore. These transition animals don't exist. So they propose a different kind of tree. And this tree now, rather than having the branches you're used to seeing, the graceful branches on a tree, it's made up, all the branches have these horizontal lines and vertical lines. It's only made up of horizontal and vertical lines. There's a cactus that has these arms on it. This tree looks a lot like that cactus, Sangrera, I believe, Sangrera cactus. And this has led to Stephen Jay Gould's statement of, he calls it punctuated equilibrium. And what does he mean by that? Meaning things stay the same, but then there is a punctuation, a sudden change to another form. Suddenly we see these other forms happen. Well, now let's look at these branches now. And this, now what we see is the vertical lines are actual data. We find fossils along those. But notice the horizontal arms. Since it's horizontal, in the vertical, remember, is time. So the horizontal means no time or at an instant in time. And it's drawn to have us think that there is a series of creatures in zero time or in an instant of time, and all these creatures evolve to the new form. There's a problem, though, is none of those horizontal creatures exist, meaning this horizontal line is imaginary. It's drawn. So there just is a missing thing. So all that really is there are the verticals. So now we get to redraw our tree according to the evidence. And what we see is it looks like streaks of rain. It looks like these vertical lines, but there's no tree here. They're roughly scattered in kind of a V shape, you know, coming to a point at the bottom and expanding at the top. And we still have the genus and the family, but there's no connections between them other than proximity. We see, okay, there's a form kind of like it, and after it, suddenly in the fossil record appears. In fact, they use this property, something called marker fossils. So if they dig up a marine fossil strata and they locate a certain kind of trilobite in that strata, they say, this strata is such and so million years old because it has this trilobite in it. What are they telling you? That trilobite stayed the same over a long period of time. You can find it all over the earth in all these strata over these certain periods of time. And so it suddenly appeared, otherwise it wouldn't be a marker for time. But they're telling you that this trilobite stays the same, and we, by the way, do not see the sequence evolving into that form of a trilobite. So now that we see that this tree looks like a V, let's ask a question about this bottom. What's the fossil record for this first appearance that we're told by this tree exists? So let's go look at it. Well, we have this statement here, and it's the problem of the sudden appearance of creatures in the fossil record at the very beginning. And this is taken from fossilmuseum.net, Paleontology, Cambridge Explosion. Most major animal groups appear for the first time in the fossil record. Notice this. Most major animal groups appear for the first time in the fossil record some 545 million years ago in a relatively short period of time known as the Cambrian explosion. Of great worry to Darwin, the explanation of this sudden, apparent explosion persists today as a shadowy mystery. Now, if you go look up I pulled this 10 years ago, but you go look at it, the last statement there, apparent explosion persists today as a shadowy mystery, they have replaced with a bunch of fuzzy words about theories, about how they believe it isn't really a problem anymore, we've solved it, but it isn't solved. So does this single point here look like an explosion to you of many forms? Notice at the top of our tree, we have all the branches spread out, but at the bottom we have one point. Well, where's the multiple forms that have popped out of this Cambrian explosion? It's not represented in this tree. So the tree is not represented by the data. It's false. So I have carried this over, and what I'm showing here is, notice, this is this rainfall, I'll call it, just shows these streaks of these creatures evolving, going up. But rather than starting like a V, each group of family and genus actually has dashes that come back to this line, which they appear suddenly, called the Cambrian explosion. So you have to ask, we're suddenly asking this question. There is no origin creature that we are going to find all these come from, because the fossil record just says they suddenly appeared. Now, notice here, I've moved this line up, this Cambrian explosion line up, and I've connected them all into this single, created a Y-type diagram where I group all these together, trying to put my tree back together. And I point out that this tree down below has no data. There are no fossils to support this tree. It's an imaginary theory that they come from one. The fossil data does not represent that. So, Stephen Jay Gould, if you remember him, had to admit, I like this word, we must acknowledge a central and surprising fact of life's history. A marked decrease in disparity followed by an outstanding increase in diversity within the few surviving designs. Now, don't let that worry you. Yes, it's hard to understand, and I'm going to explain it. And this was stated by Stephen Jay Gould. And so what is he saying by this? What does he mean? Okay. Diversity, by diversity, he means that at the top of our tree, we see a lot of types grouped together. Let's say this is dogs, because we're going to talk about dogs and dog kinds later. But there are many kinds of dogs, but they're all dogs. So there's a diversity of dog kind. But if you go back earlier to the very beginning, what he's telling you is out of the Cambrian explosion, there were not only the kinds we see today, but there were many other kinds of creatures. And he calls that disparity. I don't know why he picks those words, because he's really hiding from the layman what the problem is here. So in the beginning, not only were there the creatures that we see that have turned that we see today have their origin in this Cambrian explosion, but the fossil record says that there were many even other kinds. So if you've ever seen pictures or drawings of ancient seabeds or landscapes, it'll show you all these kinds of things that we have nothing like it today, and that's why they're saying this. And what they also show that as time goes on, the diversity is compressed, in meaning that many of the various forms, the disparity went away. They died out. They got destroyed in some kind of a catastrophe, maybe. So it's like an hourglass. A very broad disparity at the bottom, and it contracts to fewer ones that continue, and then those that continue expand into little groups of diversity. That would be like of your dog kind or of your snake kind, or whatever it is. You'd have the diversity in kinds. But that is what Stephen Jay Gould is saying we may. No, he's saying we must admit this is what the data shows. So what have we learned so far? A technical definition of evolution is difficult to pin down and non-specific. It is a shell game. In other words, every time we corner evolution, they create a new definition which denies the problem. Point 2, the general population continues to hold to a more specific gradualist definition, and that definition was given to us by the last generation of paleontologists, Darwin himself. We've seen that the gradualist theory, for all practical purposes, has failed as a theory. The data does not support it. There's no gradual shift from one kind to another. And we've also seen that the theory of punctuated equilibrium, that is where a creature, there's a sudden point in time when there's explosion of, that's the proper wrong term because it'll confuse you, but a sudden rapid evolution to a new kind, and then the evolution stops and the new kind continues on through time, is a desperate attempt to hold the fort, and it utterly fails to explain the major features of the fossil record. In short, no theory of evolution can stand up to the evidence. So, how does evolution happen? We're told that evolution proceeds by natural selection, and that is also referred to as survival of the fittest. Okay, remember that. It's survival of the fittest, and that is natural selection. However, natural selection is not a creative mechanism. It can only select between variants that already exist. And it does that not by making it something continue to exist. It does it by ensuring the death of the second best. You know, we have this positive view of selection, but what it's actually doing is causing the death of the second best. Therefore, natural selection and the survival of the fittest is solely a destructive mechanism. It can't evolve anything in the constructive sense. So how our minds have come to even think that we could think this term, natural selection, is somehow making something. There's nothing made in a selection. When I go to the store and select a t-shirt, I'm not making that shirt. I'm only choosing it. It's already made. So what then is offered by the community, the science community, is a source of genetic diversity. Well, if you ask them and press them, they'll say, oh, it's genetic mutation. And what is a mutation? A random and accidental alteration to the genetic instructions. And that's my definition, but I think that fits it very well. So let's look at what this looked like. And by the way, we need to understand a historical thing. Charles Darwin wrote his book Origin in 1859. And that is when Origin of the Species hit the shelves, if you will, and came on the community. The field of genetics that we're going to be discussing was actually discovered by Mendel in 1866. That's just 7 years later, okay? But it was ignored until 1900 when someone else rediscovered it, and there's a reason that it was ignored. Mendel wrote papers, and it was sent out multiple times, but it just fell on deaf ears. So we'll discuss why that was. So we have a picture here of a book, just an open book laying here. And I say an animal's genes are its assembly instructions. So written into the genes are its instructions of what that animal is going to be. And I have lines, green lines, kind of representatively drawn on this book, and one of them represents the eye color, the disposition of that animal, how it lives, its frame, its hair color, and all those instructions go into producing this creature we see below, which is a wolf, a gray wolf. Now we have, in genetics, we see that there's a variation in successive generations. So up at the top, we have the male and female of a wolf up here, and they're slightly different, one larger than the other, whatever, but they have a litter. There's a litter produced. But the litters, even though wolves look the same, there are variations in those, and I've amplified them here in these pictures. There's some larger, some smaller, color variations, eye color, whatever it would be. And why does that happen? It's because there are many other instructions in this book than you see in the animal. They're called recessive traits. So there can be a recessive trait. I think that pretty much all wolves probably have brown eyes, although once in a while you'll probably see some eye color pop up in a wild wolf. But eye color, the brown, is the dominant trait, and it hides underneath it the instruction for blue eyes. And by whatever mechanism occurs in genes, the trait that is dominant, the dominant trait, is turned off, and then you see the recessive trait appear. So in this wolf I have shown with blue eyes down here, for whatever reason and mechanism, the blue eyes appear. But the blue eyes didn't evolve. They were there. The instruction was there. It's just that the instruction for brown was turned off when it got to this particular pup, this wolf pup. So what we know is that wolves were the breeding stock, and people took them, and if you take wolves, take a pair of wolves, and you produce pups, and then you select among those pups. Let's say if you look for ones that aren't as wild and will attack you, look, domesticability, have a nature that's more in keeping with what a man would need. And maybe you find that it has certain properties or traits or characteristics that make it useful for certain tasks. Maybe you want it small to go hunt for something, or help you hunt for something. And particular looks. Maybe you want something large or small or short-haired or long-haired, depending upon where you need this animal to work. So what can happen? What's the end result if you start breeding wolves and try to generate a specific traits? Well, the answer is dogs. All dogs are descendants of the gray wolf, and they aren't evolved from the gray wolf. They are bred out of the gray wolf. Very important distinction. And what does it mean by breed out? It means that we know the traits that are in all dogs are hidden in the gray wolf. They are recessive traits that have been bred out for particular traits. And as you know, ancient man basically went on a major breeding campaign to create some animals that go into, like the dachshund, was to go into burrows and pull certain animals out of their burrows. Others were, for taking down bears. They were very large dogs. And anyway, so all these dogs, we've turned them into pets, but they were really working animals early on, and most of the breeds were designed for it. But the point is that you can take a wolf, apparently today, and if you've got the time and the resources and it takes multiple generations even of the breeders, you could rebreed out pretty much the same breeds, maybe even some others that weren't. So all breeds of dogs are descendant from the Canis lupus, the gray wolf. And all these traits were in the wolf long before they were ever expressed. And I have a statement up here, and I have the green and the red. The green is the phenotype. That's what you see. That's what's expressed in an animal born. And what I have in red is the repressed dominant trait, meaning that it's some of the dominant traits had to be repressed, so the new phenotype would have been the repressed gene before that. Now it's becoming expressed. And that's how we move along. So new types are pre-existent in these dogs. The new dogs are pre-existent in the genes. So that means, bullet one, wolves have a genetic diversity that was unpacked into the tremendous variety of canines. Number two, since natural selection can't select what isn't expressed, where does the diversity come from? In other words, we talk about natural selection, but in a breeding program, it's unnatural selection or supernatural selection, because we are not using nature, we're exceeding nature in our selection. So either way, we are causing these animals to change, or the successive generations to change. But the question is, where did that diversity come from? We'll hold on to that for a moment. Corn originally it's called maize, actually. Corn really means the predominant crop of that a culture is using. But maize is a proper word for this I have pictured here. And Indian maize that we know of came from the New World. The Indians were using it, and it was growing wild. But from that, we have bred out what we call hybrid corns. And by genetic, if you notice, look at the Indian maize, each seed is a different color. Why is that? Because there's genetic diversity in this. Now look at the hybrid corn. We're looking at, I think it's Silver Queen here, and it is all white. Everything is white. Why? There's no genetic diversity, because it has been carefully bred, carefully selected and bred, I guess I can't find the other word, to create this, the variety we call Silver Queen or Golden Queen or whatever. In fact, in the early days, the first engineered corn, it's not engineered corn, the first genetically selected corn was called Neal's Paymaster because it was the first to put on 2 ears per stalk. Now, why was that? Well, they probably hunted around, and in a whole field, every once in a while, they would find a stalk with two ears on it. And what did they do? They took those and created seed stock from those. So let's look at this diversification of canines. We've been discussing that wolf, that the, what I call dog, I have a picture here of a Dorset hound in their little book, and I say the Dorset hound has a reduced genetic subset coming out of what the wolf. The wolf has a bigger book. Actually, the book is no bigger or little smaller, but more things have been struck out of the book to create the Dorset hound. The wolf's attributes had to be repressed in the breeding program to create this Dorset hound. So what is available is smaller. And here's the point. You cannot go backwards to the wolf. You can't rebreed a Dorset hound and go back. What has been redlined, I'll call it, what has been struck out, can't apparently be turned back on. Now that may be something will happen in the laboratories, but it doesn't naturally occur. So we notice that going down to the dog, genetic diversity is reduced. It is a loss process. And number two, it is irreversible. You can't go back. You could down select. In fact, a lot of high-bred dogs have problems. You know, our dog right now is a Labrador. He's got a number of years on him, and his hip is beginning, one of his left legs is beginning to fail, and it's a worry to us. But that is because a gray wolf doesn't suffer that. That is because when you reduce the genetic diversity, you also reduce the vitality of a creature. So, and the third thing we note is that time has elapsed in going from the wolf to the dog. So, on this process was a selection by man. It was a downward selection, an artificial breeding program by man as opposed to selected by nature. And nature can do this also. Nature can select. If a wolf winds up in a unique environment in its appetite and its what food's available, all that, if the traits exist in the book, the nature will kill off those that aren't as fit, and you will have an adaptation. Has anything really changed? No, it is still a wolf and still same instruction set. So, however, we have to ask this. Today, we have the gray wolf. Thousands of years ago, we had wolf. Thousands of years ago, we had a gray wolf. But here's the question. To get to the wolf that we have, was there a natural selection process down to the wolf? Well, we know it probably occurred. There have been environmental pressures. So was there a greater set from which the wolf came? And I propose there is a more complete genetic set up there, that the wolf has actually been redlined. A number of the items, the capabilities, attributes in the complete genetic set have been redlined or turned off to create the wolf. So what would that complete set look like? What would have come from that? Well, how about foxes, wolves, hyenas, and the coyotes? All these are dog kind of animals, but they're distinctly separate from the wolf. So what does this mean? It means that if we go back in time, all these look to compress into a distinct creature, which then diversified into many different types. How did it do it? Did it do it by evolution? No, it did it by down selecting the very complete, robust genetic specifications of much variety that can unpack out of it. So, are there others that we could look at? Well, how about a cow and a moose? And its relationship to the water buffalo? Is it not conceivable that all these are really one type and all have come out of a cattle type of animal. In fact, there is a proto-cattle type, and it's called an Araucus, if you want to look it up. The last Araucus actually survived up until the mid-15th century. It died in Spain, and the Araucus was equivalent to the grizzly bears. In the bear kind, a grizzly is the most fearsome of all bears, and the Araucus was the most fearsome of all cattle kind. And apparently all cattle, and maybe moose and water buffalo, but all the cattle we have apparently were bred out of the Araucus. Extremely dangerous animal. I understand that some say that they stood 6 and even up to 8 foot at the shoulder and could run extremely fast, and they allowed nothing in their territory that stood. So extremely dangerous animal. Now, we looked at wolf, gray fox, coyote, and the hyena. How about the antelope, the deer, the gazelle, the goat, the zebra, the horse, the donkey, the giraffe? All these can represent groups of kinds. And if we go back, they look to have come. Now, geology, people who study genes would be able to look at the different genetic books, if you will, look at the genetic codes and be able to correlate these different types. And I'm not trying to do that here, but we do know that many of these types of animals are related to each other through their genetics. They all have a common backbone in their genetics of these different groups. So could it be that God pre-packed all the genes or all the genetics for all the varieties of a kind that would ever exist, that would ever be? Could God have pre-packed all the genes for all the varieties of a kind that would ever be when he created? He created with the capability for all these types to come out of it. Could it be that the variety seen in the fossil record is simply the expression of these pre-packaged genetics unfolding over time? In other words, we're not seeing evolution at all. We are seeing a pre-staged story. It's like turning a page and reading a new chapter in a book. It's already written. It didn't evolve as we turn the page. It's already there. And then could it be that all supposed evolving is just picking through the pre-existing traits? So those we're going to leave the question. Well, this turns out to bring up an ancient concept, and it has several names depending on the language, but in Greek it's called logos spermatikos. I can't even say it, excuse me. Spermatikos. Yeah, excuse me. Spermatikos. Logos spermatikos. And it roughly translates as the seed principle. And what I mean by principle is not the principle as in academics, a principle of academics. The principle here is the origin maker, the one who makes the seed or is the seed. You might recognize the word logos, and we might translate this principle of the word, capital W word. We're not talking about writings or spoken words, but we're talking about John's word, who was in the beginning and who became manifest in Yeshua. And this definition, I'm sorry I didn't put the link here. I think it's Wikipedia. If you go look at this word, logos, the definition in Wikipedia is God created the world the idea is that God created the world in seed form with certain potentialities which then developed or unfolded accordingly over time. What appears to be change is simply the realization of pre-existing potentialities. Now, I hope you caught that this is exactly what we've been seeing that is represented in the fossil record and our understanding of genetics. The plural of this, which you often see referred to, is logi spermatoki, and that is when you look at that, you have the logos is in the Hebrew, in the Greek principle, is the origin being of which the seed is, and the logi are the seed that comes from that. So the pluralization is referring to the pluralization of the logii in the earth today. And so that's a little confusing because it gets into the Greek philosophy and things, but we'll just leave it at that. But this concept was held by the Greek philosophers as true. That's the way they understood the world. And we can ask the question, where did they invent it? Some of the writings will say that they came up with it. I don't find that true. It's just that that's the first place they saw it mentioned. But know this, that this concept was accepted by the early church fathers. Justin the Martyr, or Tertullian. Tertullian, as you may know, was one of the principles in the bringing of the Trinitarian principle into acceptance by the church. And there are many others. I just want names that you would probably remember here. And more than that this principle is actually found in Scripture. And it's the writer of Hebrews in chapter 7 and verse 9 states that, this is a paraphrase, that Levi paid tithes to the Melchizedek through Abraham. What this writer is saying, the writer of Hebrews is saying, is that Levi was present. In fact, I think the passage goes on to state this. Levi was present at the time when Abraham paid the tithe to the Melchizedek. What does that mean? Well, Levi is Abraham's great-great-grandson. Great-grandson? I think it's his great-grandson. Levi is his great-grandson, but the writer of Hebrews says he was there. What does that mean? That means that the writer understood that Levi existed in the loins of Abraham. Let that sink in. That would be an entire teaching by itself. Our world has come to believe that children are brought into existence at the instant of the joining of the zygote, the formation of the zygote between the sperm and the egg. At that instant, insemination is when the person comes to be. But according to the scriptural view of the writer of Hebrews, he doesn't view it that way. He says that the person is waiting to be brought into life by that event and is already waiting in the loins. So the fathers become the carriers of all the generations after them. Now, boy, that's loaded. Okay? So I want you to think about it. There are things to think about. Notice that Noah only had to take a representative from each kind. In other words, if the water buffalo was part of a much more original animal kind, Noah didn't have to bring the water buffalo, nor did he have to bring the giraffe, because the giraffe would have been in another kind. So, but here's another one. That's one, just go and think about that a while. So the ark gets smaller and smaller, or its need to be huge is smaller and smaller. Here's another one to think about. We've been noticing the down selection of the genes. And what that eventually sees when you back up from it is that the creation has a limited life expectancy. We noted that as a creature had a genetic, the earliest creatures had this huge potentiality, and over time, the potentiality has divided up into different creatures, but we can't go back to the original potentiality, and anything that's lost, any possibility that's lost, does not come back. You can't go backwards, which means the creation is designed to run down over time. Now, I have drawn a graph here, which is a little confusing, but let's just look at it. I have kind of a purple line. I guess it's purplish. I don't have I don't have the name of the color. But it represents the evolutionary model, which is much longer in time. So on the baseline, we have time running from left to right, and genetic diversity is going up. And according to the evolutionary model, the diversity, in fact, I didn't draw this graph correctly, it should have gone from nothing to absolute extreme max at the very beginning. Boom, just shoot all the way up. That's your Cambrian explosion with all its disparity, according to Stephen Jay Gould, and then those became down-selected, so the variety potentialities was decreasing. Now, the difference is that as it decreases, and let's pick up at this point here, we then see evolution then increasing diversity. Okay, so it increases, 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 and then we have a wipeout event. An asteroid crashes, and then evolution starts building back up again and creating more and more diversity, and then crash, and then building back up, and then crash, and so forth until we get to today. And we'll talk about today's time a little later. The biblical model is what? Sudden appearance of everything. Then we have a sudden decrease, proportional to maybe a global disaster, maybe not a meteor, but maybe water that the Bible talks about. So we have a sudden appearance, a monotonic, from that point, a monotonic decline. In other words, in actual what can be done. That's not in the numbers of animals or the types of animals, but this is in genetic diversity that exists. We see a monotonic decline and one mass extinction, and a relatively, in fact, it's not scaled properly here, but a relatively short period of time. How can we compare a few thousand years, 6,000 years, to billions and billions? But anyway, I put it on this chart. But the evolutionary model talks about the Cambrian explosion, evolution drive to an increase, many extinction periods, and a long time frame. Of course, we don't see any evidence of these increases. We see animals suddenly appearing. That was already discussed. So now let's look at this today, modern times. And what we see is that both the evolutionary model and the creationist model agree. What do we see? Creation model matches the current trend. We all agree that diversity is decreasing. The creationist says that the creation is designed to run down. And if it keeps running down, where does it go? To no genetic diversity. And in fact, the world will stop to function. They say that if we get below a certain threshold of genetic diversity, the world doesn't exist anymore. We'll fail to work. This world is terminal. But notice that both parties agree. Now, the evolutionist says that we need more diversity. I'm going to throw a little point in here. Notice that the evolutionist says that we have a decrease in diversity in genetic material. And what does he believe causes genetic diversity? Is mutation, right? He believes that mutation increases it. And therefore, I can say the solution for the evolutionist is that we need to take radioactive material and spread it out all over the world to increase mutations, because that is the God that creates life, diversity of life. Isn't that solid logical thinking? We need mutations to solve his problem. Therefore, we need to put something in the environment that causes mutation, which is good radioactive material. Now, I am not suggesting that, but that's the logical outcome for the evolution. That's the logical step. Yeah, it'll hurt a few people, but we've got to make some sacrifices to cause our God to increase diversity of life. Of course, what it's going to do is kill, but he doesn't know that. Anyway, we won't try to solve the atheist problems for him. So that just brings us to the end of this discussion, and I hope this has been helpful in letting people understand how these things play out and the questions behind them. So, questions? We'll open the floor up.
Brother Pete, do you want to go ahead and close, and then we'll shut the recording off and then have questions?
Okay, okay. I'm trying to figure out how to release here. Just a moment.